I'm George. I'm part of the GIS capstone class, which a bunch of the people in here are also. So we set up this panel about gender and imperialism um, because we thought it'd be really interesting to see different members of the faculty that normally don't interact with each other.
I know I can't speak to you.
Kind of. Maybe I'm wrong. So I figured we'd start by just having each of the different professors introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about what they do.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chiji Akoma. I'm an associate professor of English here at Villanova. I teach mostly post-colonial literatures, Anglophone, African literatures for the most part, Caribbean literature, and Black British literature. But I'm also interested in issues about oral performance traditions and the ways in which these traditions intersect with written literature, with literacy, and with issues pertaining to colonialism in general in Africa. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Catherine Warwick. I'm an associate professor of political science, and I teach Middle East politics and British politics and courses on comparative law, pretty much whatever I'm told to teach. But my research is mostly on comparative law and often on gender, and I'm especially interested in gender and criminal law and gender and family law, particularly for minority communities. So my current research is on Muslim minorities in Britain.
Hi, thanks for having me. My name is Amy Way, and I'm in the Department of Communication. I study organizational communication and teach theories courses in that area, as well as qualitative methods. My research is primarily in looking at how youth are engaged with organizations and how youth develop worker identities. A lot of that overlaps with issues of work-life negotiation, which is a course that I teach. And so gender is certainly an area of emphasis of mine. When I was in grad school, I did a grad certificate in that area, and a lot of my research encompasses gender. The post-colonial part of this article was kind of the part that my co-author was the expert in. So I know a little bit about it. I'm happy to take questions about it, but primarily my issues are like gender and work life and organizing.
Oh, okay, thank you. I guess to start, maybe just to start with a pretty basic general question, how would you say that the different works that you guys work on in your research speak and relate to each other's work?
You want to start?
Thank you. Go down the line.
I'm sure we're not going to be going down the line in this sequence all
No?
the time.
I thought that's how it was working.
All right. As a kind of caveat, I have to say, the time that Professor Keita made us aware of the works that were being used in the class, that was the first time I knew exactly which of the works, at least the ones I had written, that was in play. And the text that I saw was actually a review essay I did of two very significant books that came out some years ago on African literature, colonialism, and new ways of understanding, or the kind of approach that has to be adopted in understanding and appreciating African literature. And then there was another book also that came out about the same time on Black women, literary production. And part of what the editors of that particular anthology were very much interested in doing was to see or to advance, or at least to come up with some way of reading Black women's work outside the kind of established theories that exist. So I was looking at these two approaches. So I was looking at these two texts that were very much attempting to speak to African literature or Black diaspora literatures outside the established paradigms, or outside the very straightforward theories. So that even in a text like Black women's writing, one of the arguments that kept coming up was the idea that the understanding of feminism, at least feminism as we've articulated it, understood it, studied it here in the West, that there are problems, or that it is rather inadequate in understanding just about much of what happens or the lives of women in Africa or even in the Black diaspora. And Gagiano, writing on this other book that was just about reading Chinua Achebe, Marachera, and Bessie Head, was again, in that particular text, she attempts to just move away from, again, some of these theories, even post-colonialism. So thinking about it, therefore, and then reading the kind of work that you two have done in your individual works, individually, it seemed to me that one of the things that I could see bringing them all together was a consistent attempt at interrogating, the understanding, understanding that the subject matter we address, be it Black women, be it Muslim women, or be it immigrants and the like, that it requires at least a nuanced understanding of even the basic paradigms or structures that we've always used in our scholarship. And so to me, that was very comforting in that particular way, because I was worried about how we're going to be connected. But at least there was a measure of commonality, even at that very profound or fundamental level.
Thanks. I like Dr. Akoma's way of talking about this, and I think that's largely the way I see it too. I work on law, so law is about defining and distributing power, and it tells you who has power and it reinforces that. It's also a way of telling us what the dominant values are, but it can also be a tool for challenging all of that. And so we see something, it's a sort of communication about power in society, and thinking about the ways that exists now, but also where it's come from. So what were sort of the colonial sources, and then what are the political debates about law? And that tells us something about the way people understand power or claim it or try to deny it to others. And we can see that happening in scholarship in some ways, in the same way that we see it happening in the political or the legal arena. So reading the other works, they're well outside my field, but they seem familiar to me in the way that they sort of query these things that we're trying to study.
I feel like she should have dropped the mic after that. It's good that you two are going first, because I certainly couldn't have said any of that better. But I totally agree, and I think what I see, kind of as I hear you guys talk and think about the works that you've written, what I see as the points of connection that, like you, kind of excite me, because it's what speaks to me, are these ideas of feminine or female identities that exist at the margins, or doesn't even have to be female, could be masculine identities too, even in my paper, that sort of exist at the margins, and that in many ways challenge some of the things that we take for granted or assume about identity or nationality or culture or religion or whatever it is. But I'm also, I guess it's not time for that, but I'm also kind of curious, you guys read all of these articles, right? So I guess I'm curious to hear what your ideas are on what you see as the connections, because we all wrote the articles from our perspective and read them from our perspective, but it's kind of cool to have the opportunity to have people read three totally disparate things and be able to speak to those. So hopefully we'll talk about that at some point.
Back to me.
Okay, I guess my next question would probably be, how do you guys see, being that this is the Global Interdisciplinary Department's, forum, how do you guys see your pieces fitting into the interdisciplinary and global, scale and whole concept, I guess?
Do you want to start with you?
Oh, yeah.
Let's do that.
I was waiting for that, yeah. My paper is certainly interdisciplinary in that the approach, so when I wrote it with Jeff Halverson as a religious studies, I almost said major, but he's a professor in religious studies major. I guess he was too. But he's a professor in religious studies, and my background is in communication and in women and gender studies. And so from that perspective, it was interesting just to be able to work with somebody who comes at questions similar questions, but from a different perspective. And so in the beginning, I sort of thought, oh my God, I have nothing to add to this. I have nothing to say about this. But then what I realized is all this literature that I was reading at the time, and at that time I was reading a lot in gender and women's studies literatures. I realized that these things they're speaking to the same issues, just from different points of view. And so for me, this paper really was quite interdisciplinary from the conceptualization and the writing and all that, which I really found useful. What was the second part of that question? How?
It was global, I guess.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, so from my perspective, the global piece of it, I mean, I think it's I think it goes without saying that all of our topics are global, but from my perspective, it's interesting with the Colleen LaRose paper and with her case and everything, it's interesting to see how, her identity, she was a Western white woman, and yet she was clearly dissatisfied with kind of the structures that she lived within, and turned to a very global movement to sort of resist that and challenge it and find some sort of counter identity or engage in some sort of counterculture. Interestingly, in a counterculture that a lot of people would say doesn't seem from the outside very empowering to women. That was a place where she chose to find empowerment and felt like maybe she did find empowerment. And the fact that it's social media, when we wrote this paper, it was like a little bit more new and interesting at that time. But the idea that these global identities are not just formed in global locations around the world, but that all the work that we do now and all the ways we form identity and speak to one another is so globalized. There's kind of nothing that's, I mean, sure there are, but it's hard to think of examples now that we don't have a global identity in some ways, the ways that we consume and shop and engage with others. So yes, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it, and I think I agree with it, and then you can see set alongside it the ways in which people make very particularistic claims, sometimes to push back against what they see as the globalization,
Sure.
but those things have to exist together, right?
Yeah.
One sort of feeds off the other.
Sure.
So in the field that I work in a kind of academic law that's particularly known as law and society, and the law and society field is inherently interdisciplinary. So the best conference I go to every year is the Law and Society Association, where it's legal scholars and political scientists and sociologists and anthropologists and historians. And it's fantastic because everyone's working on the same project, but everyone has slightly different training. So the interdisciplinarity is sort of built into, like you were saying, the kind of questions that we ask. Right. The global aspect, I see that both in terms of what's being politically contested or contested in the law and where the law comes from. But for me, it's also just literally about how I study the topic. So I started studying criminal law and gender issues in Jordan, and that led me to query how we deal with gender and violence in the law around the world, because understanding it comparatively helps me to understand the particular manifestations. It helps me to categorize better. It's an analytical strength to approach it that way. But it also leads me into studying literally different systems. So my current work is on how minority communities use law for identity purposes in a very different context in Britain. So that for me is the global aspect, that these questions lead you to need to know more about the world, I think.
Thank you. I don't know. For me, the work I do in general is interdisciplinary. I'm in the English department. I teach literature, but it's the kind of literature, whenever we talk about post-colonialism, for example, there's no way you can really talk about post-colonialism, even in literature, without referring to history, without understanding the kind of ethnography or the kinds of demographics of the societies from where these literatures are produced. At least that's my worldview, that these literatures cannot be understood in isolation, that you cannot understand Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, for example, without understanding colonialism, without understanding the first arrivals of Irish and British missionaries in West Africa by the turn of the 18th century and thereabout. So in other words, there is always, I have to I don't have much choice than to go into that. It's like currently I'm doing some research on a particular drama production that took place in Nigeria, but it was set in colonial times, and I couldn't get into it fully without having to ask some of my history colleagues to tell me about how to access some archives, which I needed to get to in Britain about Nigeria. But it's that kind of interest, but it's that kind of constant, movements, if you will, scholarly movements outside, the hardcore literature, literary appreciation, that becomes part of my own, the way simply my scholarship goes. So there is always that, but it's also true that the writers themselves demanded the literary works from places in Africa, places in Africa or here in the Americas, or to some extent in Europe, that these are writers also that do demand, that in fact call attention to these other kinds of disciplines. It's global. The work you read, of course, you notice that it's an anthology of writings by Black women across the globe. Many of them from Africa, some here in the United States, some in the Caribbean, and some in Britain. They're reading these literatures and studying them. One of the humbling things that I've had is, that I've come to realize from these kinds of studies, again, through these kinds of global, intercontinental kinds of discussions, or analysis, is that it really makes one to be humbled about one's own space. You may feel very comfortable that you are solid in American studies, if you're an American, or that you are solid in Nigerian literature, as I am, and maybe you become tempted to start making claims that go beyond that area that you may well be very familiar with. And you read these things, you study these other territories, these other spaces, and it begins to give you a different kind of dimension. And even when we talk about Black diaspora, we are not talking about one kind of homogeneous entity or a homogeneous construct. That in fact there is a whole world of difference between living, being a member of the diaspora in the United States versus being a member of the Black diaspora in Jamaica or in Grenada or in the UK. That there are all these kinds of differences and with very profound implications in how we understand these discussions once you place them within this global scale. And to me, that is such a very useful thing to also convey to my students, understanding that constructs that we make, bodies of knowledge are very much complex, and a global view very much reinforces that particular kind of notion.
Those were the only two really general questions I had written down.
Can we leave now?
Yeah, we're done. No, now it's their turn.
I could be done. But I just wanted to pick up on something that Dr. Warwick mentioned, that you mentioned that by looking at things from a global perspective, you can really find out the particulars of on a regional level, only by looking at it from the bigger picture can you really get the smallest details, because you can compare them across the things. I just wanted to see if Dr. Coma and Dr. Way also agreed with that type of approach to maybe research and have experienced similar things, because I thought that was really interesting, that point in particular.
I do. I agree. I do. Yesterday, right now I'm teaching a graduate course, literary theory, and last night we met last night, and last night we were looking at feminism, the theory itself. And one of the things we read was an essay by Audre Lorde, and Lord was looking at, in that essay, she was looking at the ways we understand difference. Difference and the implications, the ways we understand difference and how we should break out from binarisms, the colonizer and the colonized, male, female, oppressor and oppressed. These are all binarisms that, and one of the things that she was saying in that essay is the sense that we are prone, you can't deny that as human beings, we find there is a convenience that comes with binarisms. It's a very clean way, it seems, of dividing things. And so one of the arguments what she makes in that essay is this idea that difference, recognizing difference is fine. That that difference doesn't have to be one where you say one is taller and the other one is shorter, and therefore the taller one is better than the shorter one, because that is usually how many differences, especially when it comes to binarisms, that we don't establish binarisms on this horizontal plane. We also create some kind of hierarchy, which one is higher and which one is lower. So it's going vertical. And so Lord makes this argument, therefore, that the critical thing is to recognize difference and then eliminate, the kind of hierarchical structures that sometimes go with difference. What do I mean by that? Or what are we saying? What it says basically, or the implications for us, is that there is virtue in recognizing in expanding one's views of any particular idea. And globalization, or globality, as Professor Magan Cater and I, carved up that word somehow and moved on with it, globalisms or whatever we call it. But that, having a global approach is very much a recognition of difference, but a difference that enhances, that doesn't create hierarchies. It's a way of understanding that what happens here in the United States is invariably significant. You can't ignore it. But it's also important to know what is happening in Syria, to understand the peculiarity of the Syrian situation, to understand the peculiarity of the Kenyan situation. It isn't one that says the Kenyan situation is necessarily more dire or less serious than whatever is happening elsewhere. But it is a recognition of at least the idea that there may well be points of convergence, and that the points of convergence are as significant as the ways in which they differ. To me, that is always what seems to be at the heart of approaching ideas, approaching how we understand ideas through these kinds of comparative, very expansive, ways of doing it. So to me, that is the virtue I find in recognizing, the good of a global, consciousness, if you will.
Yeah, I would just say that this paper that we write in many ways is a case study. I mean, it's a case study of one woman, so it's very, we're trying to get into the particulars of this woman. And in the introduction of the paper, we say that our goal is to sort of disrupt these discourses of religious extremism, and say let's look at one woman's actual life history, her social context, things like that, to sort of see what perhaps led her to make these decisions, and feel the need to join this larger movement. And so I think, I think there's no question that you lose something if you're not doing that to some degree. Not that both aren't useful, but you lose something. In this paper, I cite Chandra Mohanty, and I was looking back at that a couple weeks ago, and she talks about how, and the reason I was looking at it was for my work-life negotiation research in the class that I teach. And she talks about how we sort of portray some of these issues in the globalized world, and we sort of have these stereotypes or archetypes, or there's different kinds of women that exist, and we can kind of point to all these different exemplars women who work in the globalized world, or who are marginalized in this way. And she says, but in some ways, when you paint this singular monolithic view of women as the working mother or the domestic laborer who moved from a third world country to a first world country to make money for her family. When we paint people in these kind of one-sided narratives, we just lose so much of that context that is really central to their story and the choices that they make and the ways that they identify. And so I guess I'll leave it at that. But I think obviously that's a statement that we could all get behind.
Yeah, if I may just, and that's a very good point, and which just reminded me of the value in interrogating some of these received ideas or information that we always go by. I think about this, back in 1997 or 1998, there was a book that came out, The Invention of Women, by Oyerunke Oyewumi. It was an extraordinary book because one of the key arguments that she makes in that particular book was the idea that the common discourse is to say that one of the things that happened with colonialism in Africa was the liberation of women. African women, and again, and I'm saying that with a lot of erasure around it, because even the idea of just the idea of African women as a term in itself is pretty problematic. It's such a very vast, such a very vast group that I don't even know how you can say African women or African women, in one fell swoop. But in any case, and so she was, and just because of that, in fact, Oyewumi, therefore, goes into these, locates her discussion within southwestern Nigeria. And the argument about the value of colonialism to African women in that broad sense was this sense that colonialism brought about Western education, and African women were able to break free from patriarchal constructs and patriarchal impediments, and went to school, secured employment, and became free or became economically independent as a result. There's a measure of truth in that, that across the board, some invariably, men and women invariably were able to be educated in this new mode of learning, the Western education, and were hired ultimately on graduation into the colonial civil service, and after independence were able to be the new managers of these new countries. But Oyewumi was also saying that if you take that trajectory, or if you simply operate on that particular narrative of colonialism, then you will also miss out on the profound disruption that took place even in women's lives as a result of that particular experience, of that particular encounter. And part of what she argues, looking at the world, looking at pre-colonial Yoruba society, she was able to now begin to draw out all the kinds of the status of women that was more complex, that was more nuanced than had always been projected as part of the narrative of colonialism in terms of the position of women as inferior. And she was just creating it wasn't a new narrative as much as retrieving a narrative or a dynamic, a dimension of the lives of these Yoruba women that had totally been eclipsed through colonial narrative. And so it is that value of disrupting that narrative, as you were saying, Amy, that becomes so critical, that it also makes our work so exciting, because you have to be disposed to wanting to see these disruptions, to see these fissures, to see these ways in which that common narrative is being upended in order to perceive those kinds of disruptions in the first place.
Or did you want to say something?
Yeah, we have questions.
Hi, so this is kind of directed to all three of you, but I I guess it starts with you, Dr. Warwick. When I was reading your work, it's on, for those of you who didn't read the article, on how rape and honor killings are approached with kind of gendered law in Jordan. And I was surprised to see that the basis of that law is actually from the French judicial tradition and Napoleonic law. But now it seems like the traditional government is viewing, I guess, more feminist push as a westernized force that is pushing into the dominant culture. So I was wondering if you could respond to that, and I know, Dr. Way, you also write about Islamic feminism, and Dr. Akoma with kind of, is feminism in this sense acting as a colonizing force, or is it promoting equality? How do you work with that space of dominant culture?
Okay. Well, this is going to take a while. We're going to need to send out for pizza. This is a really good question. I mean, just trying to pick apart the genealogy of the law was a really interesting exercise for me, because I wanted to know, okay, politically, where did this come from? And it turns out that there's a history there that's not just about enshrining certain values in the law. It's about the political history of the place and how power was, how colonialism worked. So it is a colonial story, right? You have the Ottomans governing this area, and so the Ottomans had a project to reform Ottoman law, and they borrowed from several European codes, but especially the French. So the Ottomans borrow from the French, and then the Ottoman Empire ends, and then new states are created, and there are all these sources of law. So you have to pick apart this strand, right, and do the genealogy of law. But there's also, it's not just sort of imported from the mists of history or imported from a previous ruling power. It has to do with the current values or sort of dominant cultural forms, right? So it comes from somewhere, but it also fits its local place. Objections to laws that give very light penalties for honor killings or that handle rape in a certain way, those objections are both religious and secular, but the secular ones are often described as or couched in language that we would call feminist. And so to dismiss those as sort of speaking for a foreign power or coming from outside our own culture, that sort of thing, if feminism is foreign, that's partly just a way of dismissing them, right? Of just delegitimating them and say this isn't authentic enough. And so the battle over what's really authentic is part of the politics of this. But there's also a good reason for it in that some feminist projects have been external in their origin, right? So when you were talking just now, I was thinking about Lord Cromer in Egypt, wanting to do away with the harem and establish motherhood. Okay, I'm not a biologist, but I'm fairly certain that motherhood predated the English arrival in Egypt. But it was about not just imposing British notions, but imposing notions that were specific to a time and a class as well. And so it was this external project that looked feminist, but it was about disrupting existing traditional forms of households and things, right? So in that way, it was imported and imposed. But that's not to say that nobody domestically has enough agency to say for themselves, I am also a critic of my local traditions. I mean, if I can be a critic of American traditions, surely, right? So sorting out this problem of agency and who's speaking for whom is one that is, it's interesting if you're a scholar, but it's pretty fraught if you're an activist, if you're trying to do politics with this. There's not just, you can't just depict it in one way and say, okay, this is the solution, everyone please get on board. Because people use it they deploy this very distinction for political purposes, right, in service of political agendas. I'm not sure that was a clear enough answer, but I like the question. Do you want to?
Yeah, I don't know that I have that much more to add, but you're right, the piece also with Jeff Halverson, the Islamist feminist piece, I mean, it basically untangles this tangles more maybe this very question, but the idea that, we can like you said, we can impose things from the outside, and we can sort of give our judgments on how women are or are not being marginalized or empowered through a certain movement, but these women also have their own feelings about that. And even within a movement, I mean, you see it here in feminist movements in the U.S. Like, there's different people who are, I I keep going back to my work-life stuff, sorry, that's what I'm talking about in class right now, but the whole mommy wars thing in the US, I mean, that's what this is. It's a discussion of people who want women to be empowered, but debates about what that means and how to do that, and what that role is. But so certainly in the Islamist feminist article I talk about, and Yalda, I don't mean to call you out, but you talked about this a little bit in your qualitative methods project, right? So she did a project looking at the niqab, the veil, that some women wear, and there's so much debate around that. Whether, I mean, there's countries who are trying to ban people from wearing this, and then there's women who are saying, no, this is what I want, you know? And so as an outsider to try to sort of have an opinion on that, it's not like we can't, but it's an opinion, right? And other people have different opinions about it, and I don't know that you can say, there's not an answer, there's not a right answer, or there is, but it's from your perspective, right? So I think it is a really fascinating question.
Actually, that reminds me of this. You know, we can talk about solidarity, and we want to have solidarity across national lines and across classes and things like that. But you know, there was, in the American invasion of Afghanistan, there was this moment when the Senate is talking about essentially saving Muslim women from the Taliban and saving them from the burqa and saving them from, right? And we want to have this kind of solidarity. We want to do these things, but at the same time, no one was asking, well, what do these women want? Right? And it's not that they have no voice, it's that nobody was listening.
And even if you asked them, they wouldn't all agree.
And they wouldn't all agree, exactly. Yeah. Like there's not just one Afghan woman's opinion or one, the African woman, what does she think? But it complicates solidarity in this way. And it also, you know, I've been asked when I do field research in the Middle East and we're talking about women's rights, I've had Middle Eastern women, you know, Arab women say to me, well, okay, why Americans think that Arab women aren't free or Muslim women aren't free. And, you know, are you careful to carry your keys in your hand at night when you walk alone? You know, that there are certain risks that we face that have to do with safety and equality and all these sorts of things. And we problematize the risks that other people face as indicative of inequality, and maybe we're not quite so analytical about our own.
I think about, there's a particular practice that exists, and in fact, to the best of my knowledge, it still exists in parts of southeastern Nigeria. And it's framed around, and it's within the marriage institution. And marriage in many parts of Africa, certainly in a place like Nigeria, is complex and it's mixed. There are Christian practices of marriage, one man, one woman. There are traditional, there are Muslim practice of marriage where a man could marry up to 4 wives. And then there are the traditional African, at least within Nigerian practice of polygamy in its unbridled form, where a man can marry as many wives as they can afford. I happen to come from that tradition where my grandfather had 12 wives, and I never knew all my cousins or all my fellow, all my relatives. You know, when you have 12 wives and every woman had at least 3, 6 children, it's just a huge thing. But there are other practices as well. For example, where a woman actually can marry another woman for the purpose of having children. A woman who is wealthy by trading or by her own enterprise could go ahead and pay the dowry on another woman. And then she, in that case, quote unquote husband, will be at liberty to designate the woman, to designate the man that the woman will have children by. And the children will not belong to that woman, to the biological woman, but to her husband, meaning the woman that paid the bride price. Now, and there are all kinds of reasons why that might be, or why that whole arrangement comes up. But it's an extraordinary arrangement that simply goes outside any paradigm of how we understand marriage, or how we even understand, what is the feminist relationship, or what is the relationship between the woman who pays the dowry and these other women. What is the dynamic that comes into play in terms of the woman, the children that come out from that particular kind of arrangement, or even of the man that is essentially the stud in this particular instance, without any kind of rights to that child. But is the kind of is that recognition of these peculiarities that maybe in our own world here we have managed somehow to to bracket off some of to erase much of these kinds of complexities. You think about the kind of retrogressive arguments against gay rights and the like, and you're understanding that it's simply an effort, it's a resistance to the complexity that is gender, that is sexuality, that we, some are still insisting on male, female, man, woman, and all that stuff in that very, very strict and very, very dogmatic way. So understanding, therefore, again, like we were saying about disruptions and going against the grain, it comes about, by recognizing these kinds of peculiar institutions that exist in other places. It should humble us in terms of how we try to impose our own understanding or our own constructs of some of these institutions that seem so familiar to us that we think that it has to apply elsewhere. And yet, in these other spaces, people are more likely to say, back off just a little bit and understand the peculiarity of our own particular situation.
Question?
Yeah, both of them do.
Yeah, okay.
Why don't you go? Don't deny them their question.
In terms of doing scholarships on gender imperialism and the injustices that we, I think a lot of times recognize, but maybe not think about too much, what would you say is the best approach to doing that kind of research? Because I think for myself anyways, when I approach a scholarship or I want to do a little bit of research, it's really hard to step away from the idea that I'm gonna solve something right now, that I'm gonna understand exactly what's going on, why these people are the way they are, what's going on in their minds. But it's really hard to kind of go away from that and just let the scholarship be heard on its own. And I guess my question is twofold, and when we do that, I think when I read the pieces that you wrote, I feel like there's always gonna be some kind of bias, because we say that we're not giving these people a voice, but at the end of the day, just producing the research for me is kind of us imposing our voice onto what they're trying to say.
Great question.
Great comment.
I don't know. I have to say, the golden rule is prepare to be surprised. You want to prepare yourself in that particular way. I mean, you can't set out without having at least some kind of theory, by which I mean some kind of idea of where you want to go. You have to have that. So there is something, there's an idea that's come up to you, or that you are contemplating, or from reading other things, you see some angle, and so you do have some idea. But it requires you at least to say, all right, I'm going in this direction, and maybe this is what I hope to find there. And ultimately, it may well not be. You stumble into this one article, and it just blows your mind away. It just upends everything you've been reading, or wherever you think you're going. And so you just want to change the direction. But it's true that, to me, the way I look at it is that it begins with narrowing, not attempting some kind of global solution, as it were. By which I mean not setting out believing that there is a solution out there, or that one must arrive at a solution. It may well be a cop out on my own part, but I also think that there is a virtue in raising questions. That if what that one has done is raise questions as to what we have already on the ground, that one has achieved much. That one has also done much in terms of getting to the solution. So I'm speaking in very broad terms, and maybe you two will speak a little more specifically.
Well, I'm a social scientist, so I think you're right. I think there's this cognitive bias that is built into us. So the way we tend to deal with it in practical terms is we set up processes that are barriers to us, right? That keep us from just exercising that bias unconsciously. And so research methods training is helpful because you have to do some things that everyone else can recognize. And peer review is helpful. You know, people will be checking your work for this stuff and looking for that and challenging you when they find it. I find that looking for an explanation rather than a solution is a more helpful framework for me. So the project I'm working on now, the basic question is, what would happen to British democracy if space were made in some way for Islamic law in Britain? Now, I have some personal preferences with regard to some of the practices that I'm discussing. I do research involving British Muslims and religious organizations and also right-wing nationalists, you know, anti-immigration kind of extremists. I have feelings about the people that I do, who are my research subjects. Some of them I'm very fond of, but my job is to present the social phenomena in a way that explains what's happening and why, to the extent possible, and what the likely outcomes might be. My personal preferences aren't of interest to anybody but me, right? And so I have to be vigilant to try to check myself, but also there's just no point in the research where how I feel about it is an issue. I have things I need to do to demonstrate the evidence. And I must do those things, and someone will tell me if I don't, you know, if I get it wrong.
I'll push back a little bit. I'm not a social scientist, I'm a critical scholar, so I get to say different things. But I agree that I think if you go in trying to solve a problem, you'll likely either be disappointed or get so frustrated or overwhelmed that, I mean, you know, maybe if you say in my career I would like to solve something, but in one study to say I want to solve this, I think the answer is I want knowledge. Like, that's the solution, is I want to gain knowledge. So for me, sure, there's things I would like to change, but every bit of research I do is to just get a deeper, richer understanding of something. I'll push on the bias thing. You know, you took my class, so you know that I'm going to say, yeah, obviously we're all biased at all times, and that's a good thing. And as a critical, qualitative, interpretive researcher, you should understand the way you're biased and the way you're situated and be able to account for that. But that's a good thing, and it got you to ask the questions that you asked. It got you to study the things that you're studying. And it's a useful tool, right? It means that when you enter into a situation that you're not totally familiar, that you'll notice things that other people wouldn't notice. And you'll be able to situate yourself in a way that's really advantageous. But at the same time, your participants are also biased and situated in important ways too, and that goes back to what we were saying about the value of like particularities in research, right? So the way that you get there is through, you don't say that one interview or one study or one whatever story accounts for everybody, right? You interview enough people and you hear enough stories and you visit enough places and you study enough, you know, situations that over time you can start to see patterns, and also account for the richness where something. I always tell my students, it's rarely ever all of one thing or all of another, right? We go in and we sort of think we know what somebody's going to say, and we think it's going to be all good or all bad. We want to critique it. It's rarely all good or all bad or all this or all that. And so if you've kind of come to research that points that way, I would say you need to do more research. And that capturing that complexity, like I would never want to propose a theory where 100% of people said X, right? Because either A, that's not interesting, or B, you're missing something. You're not asking the right questions. And so I think don't be scared off by the fact that not everybody's going to say the same thing all the time, and that's good. And think about how that adds richness to your work. And cut yourself some slack too. You're young, you got a whole career. Can I pass to you? Do you want me to stand here while you ask and I'll take it back?
No, that's
You
what
just
this
pass
guy
Oh,
is
good,
for.
okay, all right.
I have to get
Make
up
him
at some
earn his.
point.
Yeah, it's moderatorship.
I actually have a kind of similar question, but instead of in terms of scholarship, I was kind of thinking about it more in terms of activism. A huge part of being like a GIS student is this idea of responsible global citizenship, which I interpret to mean that when we need to care about what's going on everywhere in the world, and we need to kind of work to make the world a better place. That being said, I also acknowledge that I have been very much brought up and educated in a Western feminist tradition. And although like I can logically understand that there are different kinds of feminism, I'm trying to figure out how I can be aware of my personal bias and still work kind of for the furthering of gender equality around the world while acknowledging my own kind of shortcomings.
I think it's about solidarity, having a sense of solidarity, there is no doubt, I'm sure I'll be speaking for everyone, that in all these places that we study or that we work in, Africa, Middle East, Europe, and the like, that even where we are arguing or suggesting that there are these peculiarities that may be the model that applies here, the model of feminist activism that applies here in the West may not necessarily apply to Africa or elsewhere. Even when we make that argument, we're also clearly aware that there are still, that women in many of these places, indeed all over, there are still ways to go in terms of establishing equality, establishing parity across genders and across sexes. And so there is always space to, for everyone to be, or for people who see themselves as global citizens to be involved in the kind of activism that you may be suggesting. The critical thing, however, is at least that for one, it seems to me that for one, if, even for me, to be here, meaning the United States, and being interested in whatever form of injustice or whatever form of injustice that may be going on for women in, say, West Africa. It may well, if I want to be here and I want to be involved in that kind of activism, it begins with at least a recognition of that difference. It begins with at least an attempt to understand, what are the key issues over there in West Africa. Who are persons there, women or men, who are leading the charge in that which I'm interested over there? How can I help them, or how can I join them? What kind of need? They need to tell me how I can be of use to them. I can be here, and I think that the best thing I can do is to go and set up a Twitter feed or a Facebook page. And they're like, dude or lady, that's not even, we don't care about that. That's not, nobody has internet access or whatever, and you're talking about Twitter feed. So it becomes, something therefore where it is not enough to say there is a problem at the other end and I want to be part of it. One has to also do the little homework of finding out who are those who are actually involved in this kind of thing. Is that even the need they have over there? And how, what do they want from me in order to make it meaningful? Because there is always going to be, need for activism across the globe. But whenever we are stepping over to these other territories, it seems to me that it's so useful to find out what's being done there already so that one can know how to be effective and be meaningful to them over there as well.
Maggie, I'd also say, I doubt if someone from another tradition said, oh, my own experiences are so particularistic, that's a shortcoming. I doubt you'd accept that from someone else. Don't regard that as a shortcoming, regard it as a potential contribution. And it's not that you're necessarily seeking the one viewpoint to understand it all globally, right? There's a lot of contributions to be made, and they're going to come from different places. Recognizing limitations is great, but I think the way to get around it, what solidarity requires is not that we all be the same, but that we listen to each other, we take each other seriously. So listen to other voices. Don't speak for people without listening to people first, right? So listening to other voices means listening to more than one of them and not finding that handy category of, I know a Muslim woman who says X, therefore Muslim women think X, and I shall do the following thing, right? And we have a lot of voices that aren't maybe very well heard, but we can certainly seek them out. And it's easier and easier over time to do that. That's just a handy self-corrective as you go along. If you're worried about suddenly turning into an evil imperialist, I think the risk is low.
Then you're okay. Yeah, you're good.
So, you know, just embrace your own tradition as valuable to you. You know it intimately, and you experienced it for a particular set of reasons that are really relevant in that context. Don't dismiss it, but, you know, listen to other people too.
Yeah, my advice was exactly the same. Don't think of it. Don't think of it as something you have to apologize for, but rather something that's a tool for you to use. Right? Doesn't mean you have to use that tool every single time, but it is in your toolbox and it is a useful thing. So I don't know that I have anything, you know, aside from what's been said to add, but I think it can be a strength, and it is not something you should apologize for. I always talk to my classes about, you know, I teach. I am proudly a feminist, and most of what I teach is, you know, rooted in some sort of feminist tradition. And I'm standing here in high heels and a skirt and makeup. Like, we also have to live in the world, you know. So you can have these values and goals and ideologies, but you're also a person that has to live in the world, and that can be a really complex thing. So you also have to cut yourself a little bit of slack too, because you can have these ideals and visions and things like that, but you have to exist in the world too, and be able to make choices. And if you're so worried about doing the right thing that it keeps you from doing anything, that's not helpful to anyone either.
So I actually came to this talk later, so I haven't read your specific works, but I think, like, being here for the talk, I think you might be able to provide some insight. I'm interested in international development. You talked a lot about not making binary claims or not considering things as a monolith, but overwhelmingly you have movements like the He for She campaign and sort of global social movements that tend to see universally, you know, development is beginning to recognize that we aren't taking advantage of women in a lot of developing communities, and you're restricting economic development, and that seems to be a really pervasive and a really sort of global thing that lots of developing communities can identify with. Same goes for education. We're not educating our girls in many, many different cultures, so that seems to me, you know, like universal. So I definitely understand the need to understand the locality of the problem for development or for education, but is there any sort of value in having those global social movements?
I might defer. I mean, no, yes, there's value, but I might defer to either of you feel compelled to.
Okay. Yes, there's
Yeah,
value.
exactly.
There's value.
There's value.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's value beyond just the sort of awareness raising, which is sometimes just an end in itself and it doesn't go anywhere. But it's valuable insofar as it can help us to think more critically about the problems we want to solve and how we understand what those problems are, why some problems are getting identified and others aren't. And so I think particularly we're talking about gender, there are definitely trends and patterns around the world that we need to recognize that are cross-national and cross-regional, and knowing that helps to promote better analysis of how we change policies or how we give people better voices, right? So it's useful in that way. Where it becomes not useful is if we suggest that, well, there's only one sort of problem with gender, and once we empower all the women, which will mean X number of seats in parliament and this literacy rate, we're done. Because it's not going to work that way, right? So we don't want to lose the particularism in seeing the global trends, I think. I don't know if that was very helpful.
It is very much. So I will agree. There is value in it, but but I also think about there's an expression I only know it's actually used in French-speaking West Africa, but I know only the English translation, which is it talks about women with open eyes, and you know, another expression is about women who are totally empowered through their mercantile abilities. They are traders, they are merchants, they sell, they buy and sell goods. And it's an extraordinary, one of the striking things about women in West Africa, and I'm very comfortable using that term for that particular, group of, section of of Africa, is that a lot of the economic activities that take place in that part of Africa actually is very much done, is, conducted by women. They are part, you go to markets and many of the traders are women. These are women who therefore, by just that virtue, make a lot of money, or at least they are financially, they're economically empowered through the very business of going out to acquire goods and sell those goods. So if you think about we're talking about an entire economy, or economies that are controlled very much, or where the key participants are women. If you think about that, and you start talking about economic empowerment for, say, West African women, it requires clearly that you cannot frame it in the same way where, say, maybe women don't go out to trade, or where they are not even allowed to engage in certain kinds of economic activities. That is a different kind of need, or there is a different kind of set of concerns that these women in these particular kinds of societies may well be encountering. What I'm trying to suggest, therefore, is that, again, there is virtue in these kinds of global social movements, but it just seems to be that globalism is so unwieldy. There's something that's so much about it that also erases difference, that doesn't quite account for these particularities. That when we talk about, and yet we are talking about the virtues of globalization of sort, I think it's a way of trying to make a distinction between having a global view of ideas, meaning not that one has this common universal idea about the whole world, but the idea of recognizing differences, across the globe. I think that is my own understanding of a global view. And so that is why any kind of totalizing or generalizing social movement in that kind of broad sense, to me, I'm always a little bit wary about it. When it seems to me that it may not well be accounted for, again, the kinds of different needs and realities that are bound in different parts of the world.
Yes.
I would just add one thing to that, and it goes to the interdisciplinary aspect of what we're talking about tonight. One helpful corrective is that we work with scholarship from across disciplines because, as we said earlier, we need to. And this goes to Maggie's question too, that sometimes what you need training in a particular discipline to engage in interdisciplinary work. It's not non-disciplinary work, right? So any problem that you want to tackle, you might find it a helpful corrective if you, the economist, who has this grand general plan for economic empowerment, speaks to the historian or the cultural expert who says, well, actually, in this particular place, this wasn't the pattern, right? So by collaborating that way across disciplines, that's one of the ways that we help to solve the problem of the grand generalities. You see what I mean?
So for most of this conversation, we've been talking about gender we talked about binaries, but we've been talking about gender in a very binary and not simplistic, but a very concrete way. And Chiji, you mentioned earlier about the complexities in Western Africa, about the way gender and sexuality works. And I wondered if, in your research, you could speak to the way non-binary genders have been affected by imperialism or by the law that you've interacted with and things like that.
Well, to me, in the colonial experience, I could simply, if we just look at the colonialism which came alongside Christianity, would join colonialism, in Africa by the 19th century, after the abolition of slave trade, and then new kinds of economic interests in Africa had to emerge once human slavery, was abolished, at least theoretically. That colonialism, and then one of the things was the question of property rights, the way that people inherited stuff, the ways that property went from one person to another, and the institution of marriage, for example. In some pre-colonial African societies, marriage, or rather property, was inherited not through marriage, because in other words, a woman still had access to inheritance, to property, without having to be married, because the woman was first and foremost, a daughter, a child to someone else. And so the property and inheritance therefore went in that particular direction, by way of being the daughter of X, or being part of a lineage. And some inheritances didn't come through directly from, in a biological sense, through father or mother, but in fact came through being part of a community, being part of a clan, being part of a lineage. And then here comes Christianity, and here comes colonial law that very much defined inheritance laws according to where you married. And so a woman was now only, got married and now became part of the husband's family. And oftentimes, even though she was not part of this family, members of that family still saw her as an outsider. But now you now had new institutions, new legal protection, new laws that said that she couldn't, once she's married, that she couldn't return to her own family's house as a way, to inherit anything. She was not stuck in this marriage, and even when that marriage was over, she was still very much tied to that, without full access to what was existing in this marriage. So you now had these new ways of understanding, a new kind of policy that now very much victimized the woman. The options or the avenues that she had in terms of inheritance, or in terms of establishing her own self within the community, were now circumscribed by these new laws that were established and that were being also promoted and enforced through the church in those places where Christianity took root. So so you therefore find that what I'm trying to suggest is that here was one instance, and there are many, many other ramifications, but here is one instance where the kind of dynamic protocols or cultural practices that offered more possibilities for the woman in terms of how she could move up, or in terms of how she could basically survive or be part of this particular community, we are now being circumscribed through this new colonial experience of trying to impose Western inheritance laws or any other kind of Christian protocols within a community that had already solved its own problem, that had already established for itself its norms as to how how things work out.
I think similarly, in a way, in my own work, what I find is that the law and politics is deployed to maintain the gender binary and to maintain you were talking about the hierarchical.
Yeah.
There's two categories. We're going to maintain them and make sure they stay hierarchically organized. So people who either on gender or sexuality grounds fall outside that binary are problematic for the system, and a lot of the law and politics goes to resolving that alleged problem, right? But in some unexpected ways, so that you have, for example, people may know that in Iran, sex reassignment surgery is much more common than you might think and much more available. But the reason for that is not a less binary conception of gender, it's just another way of enforcing the gender binary by making gender and sexuality line up, right? But what I do see, I do a little bit of work on English family law, and there are these really interesting legal developments to assign parentage to 3 people, and it has to do with developments in genetic technology, but also just developments in family, in the nature of families. So we find law as a way of sort of accommodating these things and giving them a legal reality, generally trailing some distance after they've got a social reality, right? But you can see a lot of it play out in that arena, at least.
it's a similar thing in communication. I think what we're finding now is that, especially in organizational communication, which is my area, in organizations and socially, the research basically says that these people are invisible. And I hate that it's right now, but that's how it is. I think also it's mostly invisible among researchers themselves for various reasons. A lot of times we research ourselves, right? So like if a lot of white people or middle class people are in academia, that's often who we research. We also research you all, college students, because it's a captive audience. And so I don't endorse that, but that's what happens a lot of times. So you'll see the people that get talked about are the people who do the research, right? In a lot of ways, but that is changing. In my area, I study youth, and nobody is willing to talk about youth as organizational members or contributors or things like that. And so we're changing some of that. One of the cool things is that in some of my research with youth, youth are more open to talking about some of these things, about not really subscribing to these binary gender roles or sexual identities or things like that. So I do actually see a lot of promise in that research. And in a lot of my friends are now doing research with like transgender issues especially, but I think it's an example of the research maybe lags where kind of social change is making some moves. Research is still needed in a lot of ways.
Anybody else have any other questions?
We have answered all of their questions.
Done.
Whew, no
It's a
questions
day.
left.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we have it till 6:30, and it's not that long.
You just want to run out of the clock?
Yeah,
So I figured just to wrap it up, like as a concluding question, maybe to step away from the actual topics and talk about us being here. Maybe as a concluding comment, each of you would like to say something maybe about how, like whether this type of thing where we have different professors from different disciplines have a conversation where they might, about something that you wouldn't automatically assume is related, how that might be beneficial to like Villanova as a community and that kind of stuff.
I think I remember the first time that Dr. Kada had mentioned this particular project, this idea that he was making students, read these specific works by Villanova faculty, discuss it, and then that he was going to invite them to, invite the faculty to talk about them. I just love that idea. And so it came to me as I was pleasantly surprised when he emailed me to say, hey, you are up, that, you're one of those whose works will be read, and to me, it was quite flattering in that sense because, in my own particular instance, it's a shame, but oftentimes the things I write about are not the things I teach in my class. So I'm always, now and then a student says, whoa, I was looking for something and then your name came up. I said, oh, really? Okay. So to me, it's such a very, it's very flattering in a way, to see you reading specifically the things that we have written. And there is value in it because, like I said, when I don't have many opportunities to talk about the things I write, there's just this kind of dichotomy between what I teach in class and what I end up choosing to write about. To have that opportunity, therefore, is very useful because, again, it's almost a kind of making it worth the while, But more than that, it's also, I was reading, once Megan sent your articles and I was reading, I'm like, whoa, this is very, I never had an opportunity to read them. So it has value in that particular way, that there's a cross-fertilization of ideas, knowing what my colleagues are doing in that very particular specific way. So to me, this is very useful and I thank you for taking the time to read these articles.
Yeah, I'd like to endorse all of that, what he said. I don't know if you guys, I mean, I hope this is helpful and stimulating to you, but I don't know if you realize how few opportunities we get to talk to each other about our research and to read each other's work. I mean, we'd love to do it,
Exactly.
but pressure's generally sort of, we all have limited time, right? So getting to read these works that I would have loved to read, but I wouldn't have done it unless we'd been doing this week, and then listening to them talk about their research and explaining how it fits in. Like I said, I hope it's good for you, but it's
exactly.
great for us. This is kind of a fun thing to do, and we don't get to do it very often. So, yeah, thanks again for the forum.
Absolutely. I often say to literally the professors in my department, I'm like, how do I not know what you're doing right now in terms of research? So we love teaching, but gosh, it's fun to talk about this stuff and to talk about it with people who you don't usually talk to. So.
Exactly.
So thank you for at least sitting there and listening and asking some really good questions too. One thing I will say as far as the value to this type of thing, I don't know if I speak for all of you, but certainly in my own experience, you can tell what books I'm reading or what TV shows I'm watching or who I'm talking to because it shows up, not literally, but those are the things that are on your mind, and so those are the things that frame how you think of things, right? So like I'm sure when I was writing my dissertation, there were certain scholars and books and literatures that colored it in one way, right? It's like when you buy a new car or something, like you see that car everywhere. When you learn a new word, you hear that word everywhere, right? So it's like when you're reading these scholars, that you see them everywhere, and so that colors your thinking, right? And in some ways, that's a great thing. It's a lens through what, all of these scholars are just a lens through which to understand. But the cool thing about doing interdisciplinary work is you get different lenses. You get to put on different glasses. And so you get to break out of your rut. I mean, sometimes I'm like citing the same 10 people over and over, and when I do interdisciplinary work or just hear about things that other people are doing, it just gives me a different lens. And so it'll just it shifts the color of how I frame things, and so for me, just in order to not burn out and to not have other people get tired of me saying the same thing over and over, it can be really stimulating. And I think it makes you think in more creative ways, really, So we definitely appreciate the opportunity, and yeah, I hope it's useful to you guys too. Yeah.
So last quick question. Generally, like, what do you all think of like modern day feminism? I think you all kind of touched on it briefly, in the other questions. But what do you all think? Because I've heard of people standing behind feminism, and I've heard of anti-feminism. So like, just from which you all research and stuff like that. Like, what do you all think about it?
I'm for it.
Yes.
In all its ramifications. I would choose not to answer. You're an Arsenal fan. I'm Chelsea, man, and I don't know.
Oh no!
Go Gunners!
Can you just say a little bit more about why you asked that? I mean, I think we all.
Like, I think you all like. I think you were saying, like, how can, like, America was proposing to, I guess, help out like Muslim women, but they weren't asking them what they wanted. So like. I think we're kind of in a frenzy right now, just because like you have like women and men saying women should be able to do this and that. Then I think there are like women that say like against like feminism. I just get confused as to what it is because there's feminism and anti-feminism. So it's like I don't know. I was just kind of confused as to.
Yeah, I don't know that I have the answer, but. I mean, I think a lot of this discussion between feminism and anti-feminism, feminism in a lot of ways is a dirty word. Like young people don't want to describe themselves as feminists because it's sort of gotten a reputation for being like anti-masculine or anti-male or, I mean, in some ways it's challenging social structures that we're all pretty comfortable with. And so anytime you challenge that, I think you're going to get some resistance, but that's not a new thing either. Challenges to feminism have been going on as long as there's been feminism. So I'm sure from your perspective and probably from our perspective, it seems like right now feminism is really experiencing this turbulence, and you're right, but it's always been that way. So I think a lot of people who would say that they are anti-feminist, some people straight up probably are, no question. But I think many people, especially young people that say that they are, perhaps are anti using that word, but also very much ascribe to equality and empowerment for men and women. And so if you think that's what feminism is, which I think most of us who actually identify that way think that's what it is equality for, and it's not just equality for men and women, but equality for all kinds of people, right? Equality for anyone who exists in any form. I think actually more people ascribe to that than would espouse being a feminist. So I realize it's like in social situations, even in class, it's a risky thing to identify as feminist. But yeah, that tension's always going to be there, I'm sure. And so I think probably the more important thing is to understand what it is that you believe in and why. And if you proudly call yourself a feminist, more power to you, and I love that. But if you still work towards those things and you're more quiet about labeling yourself in that way, that's okay too.
Yeah, that's why I think the key there is probably label. That what is at stake, or what is seems to be trending right now is just that label itself.
Yeah.
But there is still, but the very business of feminism, the kinds of interrogation that it tries to advance of structures, patriarchal structures, the quest and the determination to establish parity, equality of genders and of the sexes. These are all these are fundamental feminist, agenda, and so every other. But within that, you now have all other kinds of strengths. So you now have all other kinds of concerns, points of emphasis or the emphasis. That is where, therefore, some people who may want to say they are not feminist. But like you were saying, Amy, but they are also talking about advancing parity, equal pay, say, and the like. Those are people who are basically maybe thinking that to be a feminist is now a curse word, and so they will not have any effect. But the issues that they still try to advance are the ones that are protecting, because they are still the issues that many feminists are still very much engaged in. So it seems to me to be a matter of label. Feminism, every age and every society will have to advance its own ways. We'll have to tackle what, the peculiar problems that its own society, is experiencing as far as the status of women in those societies. And anywhere this is being tackled, these issues are being tackled, more power to them by way of whatever name they may want to use for it.
Right. The only thing I'd add to that is, and I totally agree with the whole label question, but there are two kinds of pushback against feminism that I find a little bit disturbing. One is the position that says, we don't need it anymore, it's all done.
Yeah.
Okay, no. And two, people who push back by saying, we shouldn't be talking just about feminism and women's rights, it's rights for everybody.
Right.
Well, yeah, but we need to be able to see the way that gender works,
right?
There are particular kinds of disadvantage or inequality that are attached to gender and race. It's like people criticize the Black Lives Matter thing by saying all lives matter. Like, okay, sure, but that's not the point, right? We don't need to talk about this particular nexus of disadvantage or power or disempowerment. And I do see that kind of pushback maybe becoming more visible, but maybe that's just because of the kind of work I do, I tend to see it. But that's one that disturbs me more than the labeling question, I think.
Well, does anybody else have anything?
Thank you.
I guess that means we're done.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.